Hi guys, this is Mrs. Barnes. For those of you who don't have me, I'm across the hall in room 241. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time next class. We need to cover all of topic 2, so we want to get you guys started by covering topics 2e and 2f for homework. So what I need you guys to do is go and grab a piece of paper and then go ahead and set up your paper so it looks just like this with all these vocab terms, and pause the video, and when you're done, go ahead and we'll get started. So I'll give you a couple moments to do that. Okay, hopefully you're ready to go now. Yesterday in class, or last class on day 2, we learned about these 6 vocabulary terms. We learned what they are and maybe what a pair of those angles would look like, but we haven't learned their rule yet or what equation they're going to make when we need to solve for an angle's measure. So these first 2 terms take up topic 2e. These 4 down here are topic 2f, but we're going to put them all together in one note sheet. So let's start with complementary angles. We know that complementary angles are 2 angles that together make a 90-degree angle. Remember, a 90-degree angle is like a straight corner, right? It's going to be perfect like this. A lot of times we put a box here to represent 90 degrees, but we want a pair of complementary angles. So I'm going to put in a line here. Now I have 2 angles, and those angles together add up to 90 degrees, or their sum is 90 degrees. So their rule is that they add to 90 degrees. Our next type of angle pair we learned about was supplementary angles, and together those 2 angles have to add to 180 degrees. It's like a straight angle, but it's 2 added together. But they're not always going to be adjacent or next to each other, so a pair of supplementary angles might look something like this. And at any point in time, if you need to pause to slow down, feel free. But this is a pair of supplementary angles. Together, they're going to add up to 180 degrees. So for instance, if this was 30 degrees, this might be 150 degrees. They don't necessarily have to be touching to be supplementary. The big difference between a linear pair and supplementary angles is a linear pair, the 2 angles must be adjacent. They have to be touching. So notice in this case, together they make a straight angle. You get this straight line here with a ray in between. Just like the one above, this rule is also that they have to add to 180 degrees. Okay, angle bisector. Well, this word bisector here has 2 Latin roots. Bi means 2 and sect means to cut. So an angle bisector literally cuts an angle into 2 equal pieces. So if I were to start with an angle that looks like this, an angle bisector would have to go exactly through the middle. So that's not perfect, but it's a good indication. Something that we haven't talked about before is if we want to show that 2 angles are the same size, we're going to use the same number of arcs. So since this has 1 arc and this has 1 arc, it represents that these 2 angles are the same size. If I had given this one 2 arcs, that would mean that these 2 were different. If I put a second one in here, now they're the same again. They have the same number of arcs, so we know they're congruent, or the same size. The angles have the same measure, the same number of degrees. So our rule here is that our 2 angles, I'm going to use that symbol for angles, are congruent. And my symbol for congruent is a squiggly over an equal sign. It means they're the same size. Okay, the next one we learned about was vertical angles. Vertical angles are formed when 2 straight lines cross. So now we have a pair of vertical angles. We've got 2 lines or 2 segments or 2 rays that are crossing. The vertical angles are the ones that are across from each other. So since these both have 1 arc, we know that they're congruent. The picture tells us. These 2 here would also be vertical angles and would also be congruent. So in this case, angles are congruent. Okay, there's that sign again. And the last thing is congruent angles. The reason we add this in is in a angle bisector and for vertical angles, there's a very specific type of picture. These have to be adjacent, these have to be across from each other, but sometimes we'll have 2 angles from different pictures. So here's an example of one, maybe I have another here. And as long as I put the same number of arcs, I know that those 2 angles are congruent, or if I indicate it verbally. So my rule here, once again, is that my angles are congruent. Okay, so now we know the rule, we can set up an equation. So if we know, for instance, back to the top, that complementary angles have to add to 90 degrees, my rule or my equation would look like this. Whatever my first angle is, plus whatever my second angle is has to equal 90 degrees. So let's do an example. If I knew that this had a value of 6x and this had a value of 3x, my equation to solve for x would be 6x, this angle here, plus 3x, this second angle here, together add up to 90 degrees because they're complementary. That's my rule, they add to 90. For supplementary angles, they add up to 180 degrees. So I'm going to have blank plus blank, whatever my two angles are, equal 180. Same thing with a linear pair. The rule is they add to 180. So blank plus blank has to add up to 180 degrees. So for instance here, if I knew that this was 4x plus 10, and this one here was x, my equation would be 4x plus 10 plus x, so these two angles together equal 180. If two angles are congruent, that means they have the exact same size, the exact same size or measure. So for all of these ones, I can say my first angle is equal to my second angle. My first one is equal to my second, and once again, my first one is equal to my second. Their measures are the same number. So for instance, if I'm doing the vertical angles one right here, if I know that this is 2x plus 1, and I know that this is 3x minus 3, my equation would be that 2x plus 1 equals 3x minus 3 because I know my two angles are congruent. So that's our introduction to 2e and 2f. We're going to finish this and talk about it more in class tomorrow, but just make sure you have these notes ready to go when you come to class.